Fog curls through the ridges of the Appalachian mountains, like smoke rising from an ancient fire, clinging to the trees, as if it carries secrets too heavy to be spoken aloud. The valleys here are not empty. They echo, the rustle of leaves in the hollow, the cry of a whippoorwill at midnight, the distant toll of a church bell drifting over the mountainside. All of it weaves together into a tapestry that feels older than memory. People who live here will tell you the land has a voice of its own, and if you listen too closely, it might begin whispering things you wish you had never heard. Among these whispers, one story lingers like a wound that refuses to heal, the tale of a bride who never left her home alive. A bride whose last breath may have been taken, not in a marriage bed, but inside the walls of her family's house. To understand this story, you must imagine a world bound tightly by tradition, silence, and superstition. These mountains have always been both protector and prison. Families lived in isolation, hemmed in by the endless ridges, where the outside world felt distant and untrustworthy. In places where the winters were cruel and the nights were long, stories took on a power greater than fact. Here, a rumor could live for centuries, a warning could echo through generations, and a single tragedy could transform into a haunting that never truly ended. The bride's tale belongs to this tradition, where sorrow was sealed away not only in memory, but perhaps in wood and stone itself. The legend begins, as so many do, with love, or at least the promise of it. A young woman, said to be beautiful, was betrothed to a man whose name has long since been lost in the fog of time. Some say she loved him, others that she had no choice in the matter. In Appalachia, marriage often carried less the weight of romance, and more the burden of survival, of alliances between families, of land and inheritance. But on her wedding day, or soon after, something went terribly wrong. Death, that unwelcome guest, arrived far too early. She was mourned, they say, but not in the way we might expect. Instead of being carried to consecrated ground, instead of resting beneath the earth with the rest of the community, her body, or what was believed to be her body, was sealed inside her family's own home, buried alive, not in soil, but in the walls meant to shelter the living. Imagine the horror of that, a house transformed into a tomb. Neighbors whispered that the decision was made in haste, that fear or shame, or some unspoken secret, had driven the family to such a desperate act. Others claimed it was an old custom, something done to keep the spirit close, or to bind the house with protection. But the darker version insists that she had not yet truly died, that her cries, muffled and frantic, could be heard for days, pounding faintly through the boards, until they finally ceased. It is this possibility, that her death came not from illness or accident, but from suffocation, from neglect, from being silenced alive, that has haunted generations. Folklore has a way of sharpening its teeth over time, and so the story has shifted and grown. Some say you can still hear her scratching on the walls when the mountain wind howls through the holler. Some claim her ghost drifts through abandoned rooms in a tattered wedding dress, her veil trailing like cobwebs, her face pale and sorrowful. Others believe the entire house is cursed, poisoned by the act of making it into her grave, and that no family who has lived there since has known peace. Whether ghostly or symbolic, the legend forces us to confront a chilling question. What does it mean for a bride to be sealed away in the place that was supposed to be her sanctuary? But the story is not just about one woman's fate. It is also about the silence that wrapped itself around her memory. In isolated mountain communities, secrets were powerful currency. Families hid shame, sin, and scandal, the way they locked away valuables, tucked deep where no outsider could ever find them. If the bride's entombment was a true event, then her story was meant to be buried with her. Yet, like so many buried things, it found a way to claw itself back into the light. The whispers endured. The tale became cautionary, a symbol of the dangers of silence, of the cost of binding love and death too tightly together. As the fog lifts and the mountains stretch into the horizon, the story lingers with unsettling weight. It is not a tale of a distant castle or some far-off land. It belongs here, in America's own hills, in the quiet towns and forgotten hollows of Appalachia. And that is perhaps what makes it so haunting. It reminds us that darkness does not always belong to the old world or the exotic. Sometimes, it lies hidden in the houses we pass on the roadside, in the families we think we know, in the stories whispered at the edges of small-town life. The Appalachian bride buried alive in her own home is more than a legend. She is a mirror held up to the fears that shape these mountains. Fear of death, fear of shame, fear of what lies behind closed doors. This is where our journey begins. In the shadow of the Appalachians, with a bride who never walked away from her wedding, whose home became her coffin, and whose voice may still echo when the night grows too quiet. Whether her story is history or haunting, fact or folklore, one truth remains: the mountains remember, even when people try to forget. And tonight, we will follow those whispers into the darkness. The Appalachian Mountains stretch like a jagged spine across the eastern United States, rolling through states like Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. To the outsider, they are a place of beauty, endless forests, winding streams and hills that turn every shade of red and gold in autumn. But for those who grew up here, the mountains are far more than scenery. They are history. They are prison walls and protectors, blessings and curses all at once. Life in these hollers has always been hard, and where hardship takes root, secrets, superstition, and silence grow thick as the underbrush. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Appalachia was defined by isolation. Communities were small, scattered, and often miles away from the nearest town. Roads were rough, travel was slow, and outsiders were viewed with deep suspicion. The people relied on themselves and each other, bound together by necessity. Families were everything, whether a source of safety or suffocation. To belong here meant to live under a kind of invisible code, where what happened inside the home stayed there. Shame and scandal were not exposed to the outside world. They were hidden in whispers or erased entirely. Against this backdrop, the story of a bride sealed into her own house begins to feel not just like folklore but something chillingly possible. Appalachian culture has always carried a strong undercurrent of superstition. Many families held on to beliefs their ancestors brought from Scotland, Ireland, and England, traditions steeped in omens, charms, and old-world fears. Signs in nature carried meaning. A bird tapping at the window was an omen of death, a dream of muddy water foretold sorrow, and a dog howling at midnight meant someone nearby would soon pass. Folk healers and granny women knew charms and herbal remedies, blending Christianity with older practices in ways that blurred the line between faith and magic. In a land where doctors were rare and death was always close, these beliefs filled the gaps between survival and despair. To understand why a family might seal their daughter within the walls of their home, you must understand that in Appalachia, death was not just an event, it was a presence that lived in the house, a force that demanded ritual, respect, and sometimes silence. But the silence of the mountains is not empty, it carries stories. In the evenings when work was done and families gathered by the fire, stories were the currency of connection. Folklore kept memories alive, carried warnings, and explained the inexplicable. Tales of ghostly women wandering mountain roads, of houses cursed because of hidden sins, of spirits bound to the living world until their story was told. These were not entertainment so much as reminders. They shaped behavior, reinforced values, and gave voice to fears that could not be spoken plainly. The Buried Bride's Tale is one such story, a mixture of folklore and history, warning and tragedy. It speaks to the dangers of secrets, the fragility of life, and the thin line between love and death. Marriage in these mountain communities was rarely the romantic affair that outsiders imagine. It was, more often than not, a matter of survival. A union meant shared land, more hands to work the fields, and protection against the endless grind of poverty. Weddings were celebrated, of course, but beneath the surface they carried enormous pressure. A bride was expected to move seamlessly from daughter to wife, to bear children, to keep a home, and to serve as the moral backbone of the family. If she failed, or if tragedy struck, shame could ripple outward, tainting not just her but her kin. In such a world, the fate of a bride who died suddenly, or who was thought to bring misfortune, might be handled in strange, even desperate ways. Could this explain why one family sealed their daughter into their house, making the walls her coffin? Perhaps it was superstition, perhaps it was shame, Perhaps it was something darker. The Appalachian landscape itself adds to the weight of the story. These mountains are ancient, some of the oldest in the world, and their age is felt in every shadowed hollow and forgotten cemetery. Generations upon generations are buried in these hills, their names carved into lichen-covered stones or, in many cases, not marked at all. To walk through the woods here is to walk among the dead, to feel the past pressing close. In such a place, it is easy to believe that a bride could still be here, that her spirit could linger, bound not to consecrated ground but to the walls that enclosed her final breath. The land does not forget, and neither do the people who whisper its stories. And so, the tale of the Appalachian bride buried alive is not an isolated horror. It grows out of a culture shaped by hardship, secrecy, and superstition. It belongs to a region where family loyalty could outweigh morality, where silence could bury the truth deeper than any grave, and where a house was not just wood and stone but a living presence, capable of holding on to what was sealed inside it. When you hear the legend told by an old mountain storyteller, you begin to realize it is more than just a ghost story. It is an echo of a world where fear ruled, decisions where the boundary between life and death was fragile, and where one bride's fate became a warning carried on the wind through generations. In Appalachia, the mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes when the fog drifts low and the night grows still, they let slip a whisper of what they remember. She was young, barely stepping into womanhood, when the story says her fate was sealed. Her name is lost to us, swallowed by the silence of time. But perhaps that is fitting, because the Appalachian bride is not remembered for who she was in life. She is remembered for how she died, or worse, how she did not die when everyone believed she had. To picture her, you must imagine a girl born into a world where choices were limited, where the path from cradle to coffin was narrow and unyielding. She likely grew up in a small cabin tucked into a mountain hollow, with the rhythms of her days tied to the work of the land. Her hands would have known the roughness of washing clothes in the creek, the ache of carrying wood for the fire, the endless repetition of chores that carved girls into women before their time. Yet within that world, she was also someone's daughter, someone's sister, and eventually someone's bride. Courtship in these mountain communities was rarely grand or romantic. Families often had the first say, weighing property, kinship, and reputation more heavily than affection. A young man might call on her family, sitting stiffly in the parlor while elders watched with hawk-like eyes. A walk to church together, or a whispered word at a barn dance, might have been the extent of private interaction. And yet in those stolen moments, love sometimes blossomed. Some versions of the legend insist that the bride was deeply in love, that she looked forward to her wedding day with hope in her heart. Others paint a darker picture, that she was given no choice, her future arranged without her voice. The truth may never be known, but in either telling, her life turned toward a wedding she could not escape. The wedding itself would have been modest but meaningful. In Appalachia, a wedding was both a celebration and a communal necessity. Neighbors might gather, food prepared from what the land offered, fiddle music filling the night air. The bride would wear her best dress, perhaps white if her family could afford the fabric, or a repurposed gown dyed pale by hand. For that one night, she was the center of attention, the symbol of continuity and hope in a land that was often brutal. If she smiled, it was remembered as radiant. If she did not, it was buried under the weight of silence. But what is certain is that soon after, tragedy arrived. The accounts vary. Some say it was on the very night of her wedding, as she crossed the threshold into her new home, that illness struck her down. Others claim it was days or weeks later, when her body grew weak and pale, perhaps from fever, perhaps from grief. In a time when sickness swept through households like fire, death was never far away. A cough, a chill, a fainting spell, any could be the harbinger of the end. Families had little recourse. Doctors were scarce, medicine even scarcer. When the bride faltered, her family may have feared the worst, or perhaps they saw in her weakness an omen, a sign that something had gone wrong in her union. What happened next is where the story crosses the threshold from tragedy into nightmare. Instead of being carried to a graveyard and laid to rest beneath the earth, the bride was entombed within her family's house. Some versions say her body was placed beneath the floorboards, others that she was sealed within a wall, her presence hidden but never gone. Why? The reasons shift like fog across the ridges. Some insist it was shame that her death so soon after marriage cast suspicion, perhaps of sin, perhaps of curses, and the family wished to conceal it. Others claim it was superstition, that sealing her within the home would bind her spirit, protect the house, or keep her close. The most chilling explanation is also the simplest, that she was not truly dead. That in the fear and confusion of her sudden illness, she was mistaken for a corpse, her shallow breaths unnoticed, her faint heartbeat unheard, and so she was entombed alive. Imagine the terror of that moment, if it was true. The scratching of nails against wood, the muffled cries that no one answered, the desperate pounding that grew weaker with each passing hour. Neighbors in the legend whispered that they heard such sounds, that they dismissed them as animals or the groaning of the house, until it was too late. Others claimed the family knew, that their silence was intentional, that for reasons we will never uncover, they chose to leave her there. Whether by accident or design, the result was the same. A young woman's life ended not by illness, but by suffocation and despair, her final moments sealed within the very walls meant to shelter her. The story of the bride who never left home carries a weight heavier than simple folklore. It reflects the vulnerability of women, in a world where their voices carried little power, where their bodies could be claimed by marriage, and in death by silence. Her life is remembered not in detail but in outline. A girl, a wedding, a sudden death, a burial that was not a burial at all. What remains are whispers and shadows, the shape of a tragedy that has endured because it embodies so many fears, the fear of dying young, the fear of being silenced, and the most primal fear of all, of being buried alive. In the Appalachian mountains, stories like hers are not just entertainment, they are lessons, warnings, and reflections of truths too painful to speak outright. The bride who never left her home is one such reflection, a reminder that sometimes the darkest horrors are not found in legends of monsters, but in the choices made by human hands. Whether she died by mistake, by superstition, or by design, her story has outlived her body. It lingers in the mountains, carried on the wind like the faint echo of a voice calling out from behind the walls, pleading to be heard. The parlor was the heart of an Appalachian home. It was where families gathered on Sundays after church, where neighbors sat for coffee during visits, and most importantly, where the dead were laid out for viewing. In a time before funeral parlors and embalming became widespread in these mountains, death was an intimate part of the household. When someone passed away, the body was washed, dressed, and placed in the parlor so loved ones could say their goodbyes. Candles flickered in the corners, hymns were whispered under breath, and children were told to sit still in reverence. Death, in those days, was not hidden from daily life. It was stitched into it. And so when the young bride's death came suddenly, the family did what families in Appalachia had always done. They brought her into the parlor, but here the story shifts. In most homes, the body would remain only until it could be carried to consecrated ground, a small country graveyard, often just a clearing beside a church, or tucked on a hillside near the family farm, would hold her, the earth would receive her, and the ritual of burial would close the chapter of her short life. Yet for this bride, there was no grave dug in the family plot, no headstone etched with her name. Instead, the house itself became her resting place. The parlor where she lay did not let her go. Her body was sealed inside, hidden beneath the boards or behind the walls. Her coffin was not of oak or pine. It was the very home she had once walked through as a daughter, and briefly, as a bride. Why would a family choose such a horrifying act? Some say it was practicality. Winter in the Appalachians is long and brutal, the ground often frozen solid, too hard to dig. In such times, families sometimes kept their dead in barns, sheds, or even within the home until spring thaw allowed burial. But even in such cases, the dead were eventually given to the earth. The bride's story breaks that natural order. The decision to keep her within the house permanently suggests something beyond necessity. Perhaps it was grief, so overwhelming that the family could not bear to let her go. Perhaps it was superstition, rooted in old-world beliefs that demanded the spirit remain tied to the family hearth. Or perhaps, as some whisper, It was shame. A bride dying so soon after her wedding could cast suspicion on her virtue, on her family, on her husband. In a culture where reputation carried the weight of survival, burying her within the house may have been a way to erase the scandal. The parlor itself, once a place of gathering, would have changed after that day. Imagine sitting in the same room, knowing that within its walls, your sister, your daughter, your wife was hidden. Every creak of the floorboards, every draft that whistled through the gaps, would have carried a weight no hymn could soothe. Families spoke little of such things, but silence does not erase memory, it deepens it. Neighbors, sensing something unspoken, might have noticed that the family no longer welcomed visitors as freely. Perhaps children whispered about hearing scratching at night, or perhaps their silence was enforced with stern warnings never to mention what they thought they heard. In Appalachia, houses were not just structures, they were living testaments to the family who built them. Every log carried the imprint of hands that felled it, every stone in the chimney was pulled from the land nearby. To turn such a house into a tomb was to bind death to life in a way that could not easily be undone. The parlor became more than a room, it became a threshold, a place where the living and the dead coexisted. For generations, the story lingered, that if you sat quietly in that room, you might hear her. A faint sigh, the brush of fabric against the wall, the hollow tap of fingernails on wood. The act of burying someone within a house has long been seen as a violation of natural law, but it is not unique to Appalachia. Across cultures, there are scattered echoes of such practices. In parts of Eastern Europe, some families once sealed a body within the foundation of a new building, a form of sacrifice meant to ensure stability. In Japanese folklore, tales speak of women entombed within walls, their souls bound to protect or curse the dwelling. The Appalachian bride's entombment may be part of this larger, older pattern, the belief that human presence could sanctify or protect a structure, yet protection and imprisonment are not so far apart. What the family saw as binding her spirit to the house may have instead chained her to eternal unrest. It is easy, in our modern age, to recoil from the thought of living alongside the dead, yet in these mountains, the dead were never far. Families lived beside ancestral graves, shared meals with chairs left empty for those who had passed, and told stories at night as if the departed were listening. But sealing a bride within the parlor crossed an invisible line. It transformed a place of living into a chamber of haunting. The walls themselves became witnesses, holding not just the memory of her presence, but perhaps the echo of her last moments. Some versions of the legend insist that years later, when the house began to decay and walls were torn down, signs of her suffering were found, deep scratches carved into wood, cloth shredded at the fingertips, a hollow cavity that told of movement, not stillness. Such details may be embellishment, the sharpening of a story passed through generations, but they serve a purpose. They remind us that the horror was not only in death, but in the possibility that death had come too late, that the parlor, that most sacred of family rooms, was also the site of the most unspeakable of mistakes or betrayals. The burial within walls, whether symbolic or real, stands at the center of the bride's legend. It transforms her from another forgotten tragedy into something unforgettable. Her story is not of a life gently mourned, but of a life violently silenced, a bride taken from celebration to entombment in the span of days. The parlor that should have witnessed songs and laughter became instead her eternal prison, and as the generations passed, the house carried her presence like a stain, until the story itself slipped into the folklore of the mountains. But folklore has teeth. It remembers, and the whispers say that even now, in certain houses deep in Appalachia, a parlor may not just be a room, it may be a tomb. They say the dead do not speak. But in the story of the Appalachian bride, it is not her silence that haunts us. It is the possibility that she tried to speak, and no one listened. This part of the legend is the most horrifying, because it blurs the line between folklore and human cruelty, between ghost story and nightmare. The whispers claim that after the young woman was sealed away, the house did not remain quiet. Strange noises echoed through the parlor at night, scratching, muffled cries, faint thuds like fists pounding from the other side of the wall. At first, neighbors dismissed the sounds as the creaking of timber or the restless scurry of mice. But some swore they knew better. They said it was her, alive when they thought she was dead, clawing desperately for freedom until her voice gave out forever. The fear of premature burial was not unique to Appalachia. In the 19th century, across America and Europe alike, people were terrified of being buried alive. Newspapers of the era are littered with ghastly accounts, coffins dug up years later with bodies contorted, fingernails broken, faces frozen in screams. Physicians wrote grim pamphlets warning families to wait before burial, to look for signs of life more carefully. Devices known as safety coffins were even invented, boxes equipped with bells, tubes, or flags, so a mistakenly buried soul could signal for help. Against this backdrop of fear, the legend of the bride becomes more plausible. Perhaps she had fallen into a death-like trance, her breath so shallow and pulse so faint that her family mistook her for gone. In their grief or their haste, they sealed her away. But if this was the case, then the sounds that followed, the scratching, the cries, were not the work of spirits. They were the last frantic protests of a girl who had not yet crossed fully into death. Neighbors in the legend remembered odd details. One claimed that as he walked home late at night, he heard what sounded like someone calling his name from within the house. Another swore that a thin trail of dust would sometimes fall from the parlor wall, as though something inside had shifted. Children in the family were said to wake screaming, insisting they heard knocking beneath the floorboards. These fragments passed through generations, blur into folklore, but their consistency is chilling. Always the same suggestion that she was not silent, that she begged to be heard, and the house itself absorbed her pleas. Imagine the horror of being alive within such a space. The walls pressing close, the air growing thinner with every breath. Her fingernails tearing against unyielding wood, the skin of her hands shredded as she tried to claw her way out. Her voice breaking as she screamed until it was only a rasp. The darkness, absolute and suffocating, with no sense of day or night. Every sound from outside, the shuffle of footsteps, the muffled conversation of her family, must have felt like salvation just out of reach. Yet no one came. Whether they did not hear or chose not to believe, the result was the same. Her last hours or days stretched into a slow suffocation, her body surrendering to exhaustion and despair. It is this part of the legend that makes the story so enduring, because it preys on one of the deepest human terrors, the possibility of being buried alive. It is not a ghost we fear in this tale, but a reality. And that reality forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Did the family realize what they had done? Did they hear her and turn away, silencing their guilt with hymns and prayers? Or was it truly an accident? A tragic mistake born of grief and ignorance? Folklore rarely gives us clear answers, but it leaves us with shadows dark enough to fill the silence. As the years passed, the noises did not stop. At least not according to the storytellers. Visitors to the house spoke of cold drafts that seemed to breathe down their necks, of faint tapping when the room fell still. Some claimed to hear a woman weeping softly, her sobs blending with the wind outside. The family, already marked by whispers of scandal, grew more withdrawn. They rarely invited guests, and when they did, they kept them away from the parlor. It was said that one child of the family refused to sleep in the house at all, preferring the barn, terrified of what he heard at night. Whether true or not, the image is unforgettable. A household held captive, not just by grief, but by the restless presence of a bride who would not or could not be silent. When folklorists later recorded these tales, they noted how often the details focused on sound. Unlike ghost stories that dwell on visions, faces in the window, figures in white gliding through halls, the buried bride's legend is auditory. Scratches, knocks, muffled cries. Perhaps that is because sound is the most convincing evidence of life. A shadow might be dismissed as imagination, a trick of the eye, but a voice, a pounding fist, those things demand acknowledgement. They demand belief. Which is why the thought that her family heard and chose to do nothing is so unbearable. It is easier to believe she was already gone, and the noises were her spirit's echoes. But the legend refuses to grant us that comfort. The scratching on the walls, the cries in the dark, they serve another purpose in the storytelling tradition. They transform her into a restless presence, a soul denied peace. In Appalachian folklore, the unquiet dead are those who died wrongly, murdered, betrayed, silenced before their time. They linger until their story is told, until justice is done, or until someone finally listens. The bride's legend, with its insistence on her unheard cries, ensures she will never be forgotten. Every telling of the tale is, in some way, an answer to those muffled sounds, a way of saying, "We hear you now." And yet the whispers say, the house still remembers. Even long after the family was gone, when strangers took up residence, or the home fell into ruin, people claimed to hear it. The faint scrape of nails against wood, the hollow thud of fists, the sobbing of a bride who should have walked into her new life, but instead was sealed into darkness. These echoes blur the line between history and haunting. Were they the last traces of a desperate life extinguished too soon, or the eternal cries of a spirit denied release? Either way, the story forces us to listen, to strain our ears against the silence of the mountains, and wonder if what we hear is only the wind. A house is more than timber and stone. It is a vessel, a container that holds the laughter, the grief, the arguments, and the whispered prayers of those who dwell within its walls. In Appalachia, this truth is magnified tenfold. Homes were often built by hand, logs cut from the surrounding forests, stones dragged from creek beds, nails hammered in by neighbors. Every inch of a cabin carried the touch of its builders, a fingerprint of the family who claimed it. To seal a bride within such a house was not only to break the natural order of life and death, it was to bind her essence to the home itself, transforming a place of living into a tomb. The very idea of a house becoming a burial site carries weight in Appalachian culture. These mountains were steeped in both Christian beliefs and older superstitions carried from Europe. The dead belonged to consecrated ground, to be laid beneath earth where sermons and hymns marked their passing. To deny the bride that ritual was to set her apart, to leave her in a liminal state, neither fully gone nor fully present. The house itself absorbed her. Every floorboard she walked as a child, every beam that once sheltered her family, now pressed close around her body. The hearth that should have been the center of warmth became the site of suffocation. From that moment forward, the home was not merely a dwelling, it was a mausoleum. Appalachian folklore often speaks of houses that remember. People tell of cabins where no fire will stay lit because blood was spilled on the hearth, or homes where doors slam shut in the absence of wind because of an old family betrayal. When tragedy takes place within four walls, the house itself is thought to retain it, echoing the memory until it seeps into every creak and groan. In the bride's legend, the home is no longer neutral, it becomes complicit. Its walls are accused of holding her screams, its timbers of carrying her scratches. The parlor, once a place of gathering, is stained by her presence. To step inside is to feel her breath lingering, faint and cold. This belief that structures could hold death is not unique to Appalachia. Across the world, folklore tells of houses turned into tombs. In medieval Europe, foundation sacrifices were whispered about, human beings sealed within the walls of castles or bridges to protect them from collapse. In Japan, stories of Hitobashira, or human pillars, recount women buried alive in walls to appease angry spirits or gods. Even in parts of Eastern Europe, bodies were sometimes concealed within walls or beneath floors as a means of warding off evil. These practices were bound by superstition, by the belief that human presence could guard a structure, but they also carried a darker truth. Once a body was placed within a house, the house was forever changed. It became part sanctuary, part prison, and wholly cursed. The Appalachian bride's story resonates with these older traditions. If her family sealed her away out of superstition, they may have believed they were protecting themselves, binding her spirit to the hearth so she could watch over them. But such protection came at a terrible cost. Instead of blessing the home, her presence poisoned it. Families that lived there afterward, the legend says, knew no peace. Livestock sickened, crops failed, children fell ill without explanation. Visitors reported feelings of dread the moment they stepped inside. It was as if the house itself groaned under the weight of what it contained. The parlor was no longer a room. It was a wound carved into the heart of the dwelling. What makes this image so disturbing is its intimacy. Most hauntings occur in graveyards, on battlefields or in lonely stretches of road. But this bride's ghost does not wander far. She is bound to the very place where life was supposed to unfold, meals shared, children raised, songs sung by the fire. Her haunting is not out there in the darkness. It is inside, in the home, in the safe place that turned into a coffin. For families who lived in Appalachia, where the home was the center of existence, the thought of it becoming corrupted by death was terrifying. It meant there was no refuge, no escape. Even the walls themselves were against you. Over time, the legend grew into a warning. Children were told not to play too close to certain houses, not to knock on certain doors. Travelers passing through whispered about cabins where the windows seemed like eyes, watching hollow and accusing. Some spoke of rooms where no one could stay the night without being driven out by dreams of suffocation. In each telling, the house itself became the villain, cursed by the act of sealing the bride within it. The idea spread that a home could carry sin like a stain, and that to live within such walls was to invite misfortune into your life. What lingers most in this section of the tale is the reversal of roles. A house is supposed to keep death out, its walls keeping out the cold, its roof sheltering against storms, its hearth offering light in the night. Yet here the house itself became death's accomplice. It did not protect her. It smothered her, and once it had swallowed her, it could never be a house again. It became a tomb that others might inhabit, but never truly live in. This transformation of the home echoes the deepest fears of Appalachian folklore, that the familiar could betray you, that the safe could turn against you, and that silence inside four walls could hide horrors too great to speak aloud. The bride's story reminds us that when tragedy is built into the very foundation of a dwelling, the house will remember, it will whisper, it will rot from within. And sometimes when the wind presses against the mountain hollows, those whispers seep out, telling of a bride who never escaped the walls that claimed her. Across cultures, across continents, one figure seems to haunt the imagination more than any other, the restless bride. She is a woman caught between celebration and tragedy, love and loss, life and death. In Appalachian folklore, the bride sealed into her family's house fits seamlessly into this ancient pattern, her story echoing others told thousands of miles away. To understand her legend fully, we must step beyond the mountains for a moment and trace the spectral outlines of the buried bride through world folklore, where she appears under many names and in many guises, but always wearing the same veil of sorrow. In European traditions, particularly in Germany and Eastern Europe, tales abound of the White Lady, a ghostly woman dressed in pale garments, often a wedding gown, who wanders castles, forests, and rural roads. She is almost always a woman who died tragically young, her marriage cut short by betrayal, murder, or sudden death. Sometimes she warns of danger, other times she seeks revenge. Always she is bound to a place, much like the Appalachian bride bound to her house. The motif is clear. A woman whose role as wife was never fulfilled becomes trapped, lingering between worlds, a reminder of promises broken and lives cut short. In Britain, similar figures haunt the folklore. The lady in white is said to drift through ancient halls and across lonely moors, her pale figure glowing in the darkness. Some stories claim she is the spirit of a bride who died on her wedding day, others that she was buried alive by a jealous husband or betrayed by her family. The theme repeats endlessly, marriage and death entwined so tightly that one cannot be separated from the other. These ghostly brides became warnings, embodying the dangers of controlling women's fates and the tragedies of silenced voices. The Appalachian tale carries the same weight. Her death is not only personal but symbolic, a punishment and a warning that reverberates long after her last breath. Even further afield, the motif persists. In Chinese folklore, the idea of the ghost bride reflects the belief that marriage and family ties extend beyond death. Sometimes a young woman who died unmarried would be posthumously married to another deceased soul, her spirit bound to a household even after death. Though not always sinister, these rituals echo the Appalachian bride's imprisonment within her home. Both suggest that even death does not free a woman from the expectations of family, marriage, and duty. In other tales from East Asia, ghostly brides are said to appear on lonely roads, beckoning travelers, their faces obscured by veils, their presence both alluring and terrifying. Latin American folklore too offers its parallels. La Llorona, the weeping woman who wanders riversides mourning her lost children, is not always a bride in the literal sense, but she embodies the same themes: a woman tied forever to her family and her tragedy, unable to find peace. In Mexico and the American Southwest, she is said to lure the unwary with her cries, forever repeating the moment of loss. In her endless grief, she resembles the Appalachian bride said to scratch and cry from within the walls, an eternal replay of death turned into legend. What is striking in all these stories is the recurring symbolism: white gowns, white veils, pale skin glowing against the darkness. In Western tradition, white is the color of purity, of new beginnings, of marriage, but it is also the color of shrouds, of death, of ghosts. The duality makes the image of the spectral bride especially potent. She is both a figure of life's promise and of life's abrupt end. In the Appalachian bride's legend, this contrast is particularly brutal. Her wedding gown becomes indistinguishable from her burial shroud, her house indistinguishable from her coffin. The folklorists who studied these patterns note that such legends often conceal deeper truths. A woman's story, especially one cut short or marred by scandal, might not be openly spoken of in conservative or patriarchal societies. Instead, it is transmuted into folklore. The ghost bride becomes a vessel for collective memory, her haunting a symbolic way of speaking about trauma, injustice, or taboo. In Appalachia, where silence and secrecy were cultural survival tools, the story of a bride walled up in her own house may have been a way to express fears about marriage, family control, or even abuse without naming them directly. Ghosts, in this sense, tell truths the living cannot. And so the Appalachian bride stands among a global sisterhood of spectral women. Each story may differ in detail, but the pattern remains: the bride who never reached the altar, the wife who never found happiness, the woman whose fate was decided by others, and whose spirit could not rest. She becomes more than an individual. She becomes archetype, a reminder of the costs of silence, of the violence done to women hidden within the structures of family and home. It is no coincidence that her legend survives in the mountains, where isolation preserved old-world beliefs and gave rise to new ones. In these hollers, families told her story not only to frighten children or entertain around the fire, but also to keep alive a warning that a woman's cries should not go unheard, that silence can be as deadly as disease, and that a house built on secrecy becomes a prison. Just as European villagers spoke of white ladies in castles and peasants in Mexico warned of La Llorona along rivers, Appalachian families whispered of the bride in the parlor. Her story fits seamlessly into a vast cross-cultural tapestry of restless brides who haunt us not because they are strange, but because they are familiar. The Appalachian bride's legend, then, is both unique and universal. Unique in its setting, the mountains, the parlor, the walls that held her. Universal in its themes, marriage turned to death, silence turned to screams, the eternal haunting of promises unfulfilled. When we hear her story, we are not only listening to one mountain tragedy, we are hearing an echo that has traveled across centuries and continents, a reminder that the restless bride is everywhere, waiting in the spaces between life and death. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the Appalachian bride story had seeped so deeply into local consciousness that the house itself was no longer just a house. It was a place where whispers gathered, where curiosity seekers dared each other to linger, and where the unlucky swore they carried something home with them afterward. Even today, long after the structure has decayed or been remodeled, accounts of ghostly encounters tied to the bride's parlor continue to circulate. These sightings form the backbone of the legend's endurance, living testimony that the walls may have been torn down, but the spirit remains. The earliest recorded tales of the haunting describe neighbors hearing sounds after the family had abandoned the home. Farmers passing by at night reported the flicker of light in the parlor window, even when no one lived there. Hunters claimed that when they stepped too close to the property, the air grew suddenly cold, as if they had crossed into a different season. Some swore they heard a woman humming an old ballad, a sound that faded if you tried to follow it. These were not yet ghost hunters with cameras and gadgets. These were mountain folk, people deeply attuned to the rhythms of the land. For them, the house had become a place where something was wrong, where silence did not feel empty but alive. By the mid-1900s, the rise of paranormal investigation culture brought renewed attention to the story. Amateur ghost hunters began creeping into the home at night, hoping to document evidence of the bride. They carried Polaroid cameras, cassette recorders, and flashlights that always seemed to flicker when they reached the parlor. One particularly chilling story tells of a group of college students who set up a tape recorder in the room and left it running while they sat in silence. When they played it back, beneath their own nervous whispers, they heard faint scratching. Then, unmistakably, a woman's voice murmured, "Please." Whether staged or genuine, the recording made its way through the local community like wildfire, further cementing the belief that the bride was still there. Modern ghost hunters have reported even more disturbing phenomena. Some claim to hear pounding on the walls from within, rhythmic and insistent, as though someone is still trapped inside. Others speak of sudden nosebleeds, migraines or chest tightness that force them to flee the room. Paranormal researchers who brought electromagnetic field detectors and thermal cameras have recorded anomalies, cold spots hovering near the parlor fireplace, shadows moving against the grain of natural light. A few have captured what they believe are electronic voice phenomena, faint words threaded through static. One chilling clip, replayed countless times on local radio shows, seems to capture a woman's sob, followed by 3 desperate knocks. But the sightings are not limited to the house itself. Locals claim that the bride sometimes wanders. Travelers passing along the nearby road speak of seeing a woman in white standing by the edge of the property, her veil trailing into the dirt. When headlights approach, she vanishes. In some tellings, she appears as a bride in full gown. In others, her dress is torn and filthy, her hands bloodied from clawing at walls. She never speaks, but her silence is more terrifying than any scream. For some, she is a cautionary figure, a reminder not to trespass, not to mock the dead. For others, she is a lost soul searching endlessly for release. A number of families who moved into the house after the original owners left reported strange experiences that drove them out within months. One couple claimed their baby would not stop crying whenever placed in the parlor, staring at a corner as if someone stood there. Another tenant swore she awoke in the night to find a woman sitting on her bed, her veil damp with tears, her lips moving but no sound emerging. She fled the house that night and never returned. Real estate records show that the property changed hands frequently, buyers eager at first, then eager to leave. A house that should have been an inheritance became a burden, an anchor dragging its occupants into fear and ruin. Folklorists note that ghost sightings often evolve with the times. What began as scratching and knocking transformed into visual apparitions once the culture became more primed for imagery. Yet the consistency is undeniable. The figure is always female, always bridal, always bound to the parlor or the property itself. These recurring elements lend weight to the story's authenticity, even for skeptics. If dozens of unrelated witnesses describe the same white gown, the same suffocating dread, the same weeping in the night, then whether the ghost is real or not, the legend certainly is. Even today, ghost tours in nearby towns include references to the bride of the parlor. Local storytellers recount her tragedy by lantern light, embellishing the tale but always grounding it in the same terrifying kernel: she was buried alive, and her house remembers. Amateur investigators post shaky YouTube videos of themselves prowling the ruins, their flashlights sweeping across collapsing beams and graffiti-tagged walls, claiming they heard footsteps or voices. Social media threads brim with locals warning outsiders not to mock the legend, insisting the bride punishes disrespect. In this way, the story endures not as a dusty folktale, but as a living haunting, a narrative that still draws blood from the imagination of anyone who dares to listen. The question, of course, remains: are these sightings proof of a restless spirit, or are they projections of guilt, fear, and expectation? Psychologists argue that when people enter a place believing it is haunted, their minds fill the silence with noise. But even skeptics admit there is something unnerving about the Appalachian bride's consistency. Ghost stories shift and evolve, but hers seems to stay fixed, always the parlor, always the scratching, always the veil. That unwavering detail suggests something more than imagination, as though the story itself refuses to change, locked in place just like the woman it describes. What is undeniable is the house's power as a stage for these experiences. Even if the building has been torn down, rebuilt, or left to rot, the land carries its own kind of memory. Locals say that if you stand on the property at night, you can still feel the heaviness, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the dark. Some insist they've walked past and heard a faint tapping beneath their feet, like a heartbeat deep underground. Whether supernatural or psychological, the sensation is real enough to keep the legend alive. And so sightings of the Appalachian bride persist, not just because people want to see her, but because the story demands she be seen. Every encounter, every shadow caught in the corner of an eye, every unexplained sound in the night is another thread keeping her tied to the world of the living. She is not simply a figure of the past, she is an active presence, a reminder that some stories do not end, no matter how many years pass. Death was never a stranger in the Appalachian Mountains. Families lived hard lives, their days marked by labor, their nights by prayers against illness, accident, or sudden loss. But death, when it came, was expected to follow ritual. There were customs to keep the dead at peace and the living safe from their return. Yet underlying these traditions was a gnawing terror that few dared to speak of directly, the fear of premature burial. The idea that one might be mistaken for dead and laid to rest, or worse, sealed into the walls of one's own home, was one of the darkest anxieties of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Appalachian bride's story cannot be separated from this wider cultural dread. In mountain communities, funerals were intimate affairs. The body was often laid out in the family parlor, where mourners would gather to sing hymns, recite scripture, and pay their respects. This ritual was called a sitting up or a wake, and it served both practical and spiritual purposes. Practically, it allowed time for distant kin to arrive and for neighbors to share in the burden of grief. Spiritually, it created a liminal space where the soul was honored before moving on, but buried within this practice was also a precaution. The body was watched. For hours, sometimes for days, people sat near the deceased, not only to show respect, but to make certain the person was truly gone. Why such caution? Because premature burial was a known and terrifying possibility. In the 19th century, medical knowledge was limited in rural areas. Physicians were scarce, and diagnoses often relied on the judgment of family or neighbors. Conditions like catalepsy, cholera, and certain fevers could leave a person motionless, with shallow breath and faint pulse, mimicking death. Countless newspaper articles of the era recount grim discoveries: coffins exhumed only to reveal bodies twisted, faces contorted, fingernails bloodied from frantic scratching. These stories circulated widely, planting terror in every household. So widespread was the fear that inventors proposed elaborate solutions. Safety coffins were designed with bells, flags, or breathing tubes, so that a mistakenly buried person could signal for help. One German model included a ladder within the coffin lid. In America, patents were filed for contraptions that would allow movement within a coffin to ring an alarm above ground. The phrase "saved by the bell," often misattributed to boxing, gained traction in this context, a literal hope that a buried alive soul could summon the living. Rural folk may not have had access to such devices, but the idea itself fueled their anxieties. In Appalachia, where tradition held strong, families often kept the body above ground for longer than city dwellers did. Watching the dead was both a spiritual duty and a safeguard. Stories tell of mourners startled when a corpse groaned or shifted, later understood as the release of gases or muscle contractions, but in the moment interpreted as signs of life. These incidents reinforced the belief that one could never be too careful. The fear of premature burial was not mere superstition, it was rooted in lived experience. The bride's legend sits directly within this historical context. Some versions suggest she fell into a death-like trance, perhaps from illness or shock. Her family, grief-stricken and eager to honor tradition, may have mistaken her stillness for death. Instead of laying her in a churchyard, however, they sealed her into the very walls of her home. Why? Perhaps superstition, perhaps shame, or perhaps an attempt at protection, keeping her close, binding her to the hearth. Whatever the reason, the act violated the cultural norms that were designed to prevent such tragedies. The wake was meant to give the dead time to prove themselves truly gone. In her case, there was no reprieve, no chance to stir. Her entombment was too swift. The broader Appalachian death customs amplify the horror of her fate. The parlor, traditionally a space for wakes, was the stage of her suffocation. Instead of being watched over in song and prayer, she was silenced behind timber. Instead of neighbors keeping vigil for signs of life, they later claimed to hear her scratching from within. Every element of the ritual was inverted. The customs meant to ensure peace had been twisted into instruments of doom. Folklorists note that stories of premature burial often appear where death looms large but medical certainty is scarce. The mountains were such a place. Isolated, self-reliant, families leaned heavily on tradition to navigate life and death. And tradition, while powerful, was also fragile. If misapplied, it could breed tragedy. The bride's legend, told and retold, became a cautionary tale, not only about familial cruelty or superstition, but about the dangers of haste, of ignoring the rituals that safeguarded the boundary between the living and the dead. Psychologically, the fear of premature burial taps into primal anxieties, being trapped, suffocating, unheard. These fears are universal, yet they become particularly potent when tied to real historical practices. Imagine the candlelit parlor, the hymns rising in the night, neighbors keeping watch over a body they feared might stir. Now imagine bypassing that ritual, sealing the body away before the vigil was complete. The story almost writes itself, the scratching, the cries, the restless ghost. The folklore becomes not merely supernatural, but a way of grappling with the very real possibility that death rituals could fail. Even beyond Appalachia, literature of the 19th century reflects this terror. Edgar Allan Poe's The Premature Burial, 1844, describes in painstaking detail the dread of waking in a coffin, trapped beneath the earth. Newspapers carried sensational stories of exhumations gone wrong, their lurid details spreading from cities to rural valleys. By the time these tales reached Appalachian ears, they were filtered through local belief systems, reinforcing the conviction that the line between life and death was perilously thin. And so, the Appalachian bride's fate resonates not only as a singular tragedy, but as part of a larger cultural nightmare. She embodies the deepest fear of her time, that the dead might not be dead, that the living might become executioners by mistake, and that homes meant to shelter could instead smother. Her legend became a vessel for expressing these anxieties in story form, ensuring they would not be forgotten. Even today, the fear lingers in subtle ways. Modern medicine has nearly eradicated the risk of premature burial, yet horror films and urban legends still draw upon it, echoing the same primal terror. In Appalachia, the bride scratching on the walls is more than a ghostly sound. It is the voice of a culture haunted by its own rituals, by the thin veil separating sleep from death, silence from suffocation. Folklore is not preserved in books alone. In the mountains of Appalachia, it is carried in voices, in the slow drawl of elders around firelight, in the warnings whispered to children as they drift towards sleep. The story of the buried bride did not fade because it was written down, it endured because it was spoken, generation after generation, each retelling carrying the weight of fear, shame, and memory. By the time the house had fallen into disrepair, the bride's name may have been lost, but her presence remained, stitched into the fabric of family lore, like a scar that refuses to heal. Families who lived near the haunted parlor spoke of her in hushed tones. Parents would warn children not to wander too close to the house, saying the bride might mistake them for kin and follow them home. Some elders used her story as a lesson in obedience. Listen to your parents, or the buried bride will take you into her wall. These cautionary versions softened the details for young ears, but beneath them lay the raw truth that older generations knew, the memory of a real woman, silenced and entombed, whose cries had once been heard on the wind. Folklore became both shield and sword, protecting the living from danger while carrying forward the trauma of the dead. But generational memory does not always flow smoothly. It shifts, fractures, and adapts. Some families recalled the bride as a figure of pity, a poor soul wronged by her kin. They told her story with sorrow, their voices trembling as though they still carried guilt in their bloodline. Others framed her as a vengeful spirit, dangerous to those who trespassed, her wrath directed not only at strangers, but at descendants of the family who walled her away. In this way, the tale became a mirror, reflecting each teller's relationship to the past, whether shaped by remorse, fear, or the need to keep children in line. The idea of inherited trauma runs deep in Appalachian storytelling. Hardship was constant, families endured poverty, violence, illness, and the relentless demands of survival. Many of these experiences were too painful to speak of directly. Instead, they were transformed into symbols, stories, and ghosts. The buried bride is one such ghost. She may have begun as a real tragedy, but over time, she came to represent the weight of silence itself, the knowledge that sins of the past could not be spoken aloud, yet could never be forgotten. Her scratching on the walls became the scratching at the conscience of a community, a sound that echoed across generations. For descendants, the legend carried a peculiar burden. Imagine growing up knowing that your ancestor was rumored to have entombed his own daughter. Even if the details were clouded by time, the stain remained. Children might be teased at school, neighbors might whisper behind closed doors. Such stigma could twist into generational shame, shaping how families saw themselves. Folklorists collecting oral accounts have noted how often tellers distanced themselves. It wasn't my people, but the ones who lived down the road. Yet the anxiety of association lingered. To be connected to the bride's story was to inherit a ghost, whether you believed in spirits or not. This generational haunting found expression in small rituals. Some families lit candles when passing the house, murmuring prayers, not for themselves but for the restless bride within. Others refused to remodel or repurpose wood taken from the home, convinced it carried a curse. One chilling tale describes a farmer who salvaged beams from the parlor after the house collapsed. His livestock began dying one by one, and his children grew sickly. Only after he burned the wood in a midnight fire did the misfortune lift. To the community, this was not coincidence, but proof that the bride's suffering clung to every splinter of her prison. The legend also became a way to process larger cultural themes. In a region marked by strict gender roles and family authority, the story of a woman destroyed by her own kin carried an unspoken critique. Each retelling was a reminder of the dangers of unchecked control, of silencing voices within the household. While no one may have spoken openly of abuse or oppression, the ghost bride embodied these wounds. She was the story that mothers told their daughters, a veiled warning that one's cries might go unheard if the family chose not to listen. Her legend thus transmitted not only fear, but also caution, an encoded message about survival in a world where obedience could be deadly. Over time, the story's edges softened in some tellings. Modern families might recount it around campfires as a spooky diversion, stripping it of its deeper weight. Yet even these playful versions carried undertones of unease. Children dared each other to knock on the parlor door, Teenagers whispered of seeing her veil flicker in the moonlight. Adults laughed nervously when passing the ruins at night. The bride's presence became less about belief and more about atmosphere, an inherited reminder that the land itself was heavy with stories, that the dead walked alongside the living in memory, if not in flesh. What emerges from this layering of memory, fear, and shame is a portrait of folklore as a living organism. The buried bride's tale did not survive by accident. It survived because each generation found something within it that spoke to their own anxieties, whether fear of disobedience, dread of family scandal, or the haunting awareness that silence can kill. Trauma does not disappear with time, it transforms. In Appalachia, it transformed into a bride in white, forever scratching at the walls of her home. To this day, descendants still whisper about her. Some deny any connection, others admit that their grandparents refused to speak of the matter, as if silence could sever the tie. But folklore has a way of seeping through cracks. The bride remains a figure not only of a single tragedy, but of generational inheritance. Her cries may no longer be heard in the night, but they echo in the retellings, in the uneasy laughter of families who carry her story without choice. And that may be the deepest haunting of all, not the ghost in the parlor, but the knowledge that some wounds are passed down, stitched into memory, whispered into lullabies, until every child knows without being told that the past is never truly buried. Every legend carries with it two shadows, the one cast by belief and the one cast by doubt. For as many people who swear the Appalachian bride still lingers within the walls of her family home, there are just as many who dismiss the story as folklore, exaggeration, or outright fabrication. This tension between those who believe in the supernatural and those who demand rational explanation has allowed the tale to survive for generations. Because when belief and skepticism clash, the legend only grows sharper, more resilient, and more fascinating. Skeptics begin with the simplest point. There are no verifiable records of a young bride being sealed into a house in the region, no surviving marriage certificate, no obituary, no church record naming her fate. For some, this absence is proof enough that the story is myth rather than memory. Appalachia is full of ghost tales tied to houses and hollows, many of them cautionary rather than historical. To skeptics, the bride is just another creation of fearful imaginations, a gothic tale whispered by firelight that eventually became mistaken for fact. Folklorists approach the story from a slightly different angle. They argue that the bride's tale reflects cultural anxieties rather than literal events. In this view, the legend grew from the widespread fear of premature burial, from anxieties about family honor, and from the strict gender roles of the 19th century. A young woman who failed to fulfill her duty as wife might be metaphorically described as buried by her family. Over time, such language could have hardened into a literal tale, a bride entombed in her own parlor, a ghost who scratches forever at the silence of her kin. The story then becomes less about one woman and more about the community's unspoken fears, encoded into folklore. Others suggest that natural phenomena explain the ghostly experiences tied to the house: scratching in the walls, rats or raccoons nesting in the timber, knocking, the natural expansion and contraction of old wood in response to changes in temperature, cold spots, drafts seeping through gaps in poorly built walls, even electronic voice phenomena, recordings said to contain ghostly whispers, can be explained by auditory pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to find patterns in random static. From this perspective, the bride's haunting is a textbook case of folklore shaping perception. Visitors expect to hear her cries, so they interpret every noise as confirmation of her presence. Psychologists point to the power of suggestion. When someone enters a place convinced it is haunted, their body responds with heightened adrenaline, sharpened senses, and distorted perception. Darkness magnifies this effect. A draft feels like a ghost's breath. A creak becomes a cry. In communities where the bride's legend is deeply embedded, children grow up hearing her story, long before they ever set foot in the house. By the time they enter it, their expectations prime them for fear. What they experience is not purely imagined, but a genuine physical response to anxiety and belief. The ghost exists, not in the walls, but in the body itself. Yet skeptics cannot dismiss everything so easily. The consistency of the bride's legend troubles even the most rational minds. Unlike other ghost stories that morph wildly over time, her tale retains fixed details: the parlor, the scratching, the white dress, the cries. Even when told in different counties, the broad strokes remain identical. Could this be mere coincidence, or does it suggest a kernel of truth, a real tragedy exaggerated into myth? Perhaps a young woman did die tragically in her home, and the community's guilt or fascination spun the event into a supernatural narrative. Folklore often grows from a seed of truth, no matter how obscured by retellings. Historians have also pointed out that records from rural Appalachia were often incomplete. Many families kept no written documents, and church records could be lost to fire, flood, or neglect. Women's lives in particular were underdocumented, their identities tied to fathers or husbands rather than their own names. The absence of official records does not necessarily mean the bride never existed. It may only mean that her story was preserved orally, because no one else would write it down. In this way, the legend becomes not a falsehood but the only surviving record of her life, a ghost story that is also a fragment of history. There is also the question of why such a tale persists with such intensity. Skeptics may argue that it is a morality tale about the dangers of disobedience, or a symbolic story about suffocating family authority. But even they must admit that something about this legend grips people more deeply than most. Why this bride, this parlor, this house? Why do people continue to report sightings, sounds, and sensations in connection to her? Skepticism can explain much, but not everything. Not the chills that drive families from the property, not the uncanny consistency of witnesses who describe the same figure without knowing each other's accounts. And perhaps this is where the debate reaches its heart. The bride's legend endures because it occupies the gray space between belief and doubt. For believers, she is proof that the dead do not rest easily, that injustice creates echoes which cannot be silenced. For skeptics, she is proof of folklore's power, of how human psychology and cultural anxiety shape stories into experiences that feel real. Both sides are right in their own way. The haunting exists, whether as a spirit in the walls or as fear in the mind, because people continue to experience it. Folklore scholars often note that to ask whether a ghost is real misses the point. The more important question is why the story exists, and what it reveals about the people who tell it. The Appalachian bride's tale reveals a community grappling with death, silence, and the power of family. It reveals the persistence of generational trauma, the fear of being buried alive, and the uneasy awareness that even the home, our safest space, can betray us. Whether she is a spirit pacing the parlor, or a metaphor for unspoken cultural truths, the bride is real in the only way that matters: she endures. Skepticism may chip away at the literal details of the story, but it cannot erase the legend. If anything, the debate between believers and doubters only keeps the tale alive. Each retelling, whether framed as proof or as fiction, carries her further into the future. In that sense, skepticism becomes part of the haunting itself, an echo in the parlor, a voice arguing with belief, both of them trapped together in the same walls where the bride still waits to be heard. Every ghost story is more than a tale of the dead. It is a reflection of the living. The Appalachian bride sealed away in her family's parlor is no exception. To understand why her legend persists, we must move beyond the literal and into the symbolic. For here, within her story, lies a cultural portrait of the mountains themselves, their history, their values, their fears, and their silences. The bride is not only a woman who met a tragic fate, she is a symbol, an archetype, a haunting mirror held up to Appalachia and more broadly to human experience. At the most immediate level, the bride embodies silence. She cries out, scratches, pleads, but no one hears, or if they do, they choose not to respond. In Appalachian culture, silence often carried survival value. Families kept their struggles private, concealing abuse, mental illness, and conflict. To admit weakness was to invite shame, judgment, or gossip. The buried bride is the cost of that silence made flesh. She represents the unspoken traumas locked away in households, the cries for help ignored, the secrets entombed within four walls. Her legend asks, how many lives have been quietly crushed by silence, leaving only echoes behind? She is also a powerful emblem of confinement. As a bride, she should have been stepping into a new life, a future filled with possibilities. Instead, she is trapped, her white gown transformed into a burial shroud. This duality reflects the historical reality of many Appalachian women. Marriage was not always a gateway to freedom or partnership. It was often a cage binding women to domestic labor, strict obedience, and the authority of husbands or fathers. The legend literalizes this metaphor, a woman's life potential sealed away, her voice muffled behind walls, her existence defined by what her family allowed. She is every woman who felt her dreams buried before they ever bloomed. But the symbolism does not stop with gender roles. The bride's entombment speaks to the Appalachian landscape itself. The mountains, though breathtakingly beautiful, were also isolating, cutting off families from larger communities. Just as she was sealed within her parlor, entire families felt sealed within their hollers, confined by geography and circumstance. Her scratching becomes the sound of Appalachian people yearning to be heard, their culture often dismissed as backward or invisible by outsiders. In this way, the bride transforms into a cultural metaphor, Appalachia itself, trapped by stereotypes and silenced by those in power. The color white carries symbolic weight as well. In Western tradition, white is purity, innocence, new beginnings. But it is also the color of death shrouds, of pale ghosts, of things that linger between life and death. The bride's gown therefore becomes a dual symbol. It represents both her innocence and her doom, both her promise and her confinement. Appalachia's history is similarly dual, rich in tradition, yet scarred by exploitation, defined by resilience, yet marked by tragedy. Just as the bride's dress is both wedding gown and burial shroud, the region's identity is both proud heritage and inherited wound. Folklorists suggest that ghost brides often symbolize unresolved transitions. A woman who dies before marriage is said to be unfinished, denied her socially sanctioned role. In the Appalachian bride's case, her unfinished transition becomes eternal. She is stuck forever at the threshold between daughter and wife, between life and death, between freedom and confinement. This liminal position makes her a powerful symbol for anyone who has ever felt trapped between roles, unable to move forward. She becomes a universal archetype of interruption, of lives halted by forces beyond their control. On another level, the bride symbolizes family guilt. Her cries are not only a haunting, but an accusation. To wall away a daughter is an act of profound betrayal, one that stains a family's memory for generations. Her legend, preserved in whispers and warnings, becomes a way for descendants to carry that guilt without naming it directly. She is the living embodiment of what the family cannot admit. This symbolic function resonates with communities beyond Appalachia, where unspoken traumas, slavery, violence, exploitation, still linger as ghosts in cultural memory. The bride is not simply one family's shame, she is shame itself given a veil and a voice. Psychologists might argue that her story functions as a collective dream, an image shaped by the subconscious of a people. In dreams, houses often represent the self, with rooms symbolizing hidden aspects of identity. To bury a bride in the parlor, the most public room of the house, is to bury trauma at the very heart of the self, where it remains visible yet unacknowledged. Her scratching becomes the subconscious trying to break through, to make hidden pain known. This interpretation aligns with the way her legend is retold, not as an obscure tragedy, but as a communal haunting, forever pressing against the boundaries of silence. The bride also resonates as a feminist symbol, particularly in modern retellings. Listeners today hear her cries not only as ghostly moans, but as a metaphor for silenced women everywhere. She represents the dangers of unchecked patriarchy, of families valuing honor over humanity, of societies treating women as disposable. In this reading, The Appalachian bride joins a lineage of spectral women, La Llorona, the White Lady, the Banshee, whose deaths speak louder than their lives ever could. They haunt because their suffering was ignored in life, and their legends ensure they cannot be ignored in death. Finally, she is a symbol of endurance. Despite centuries of skepticism, erasure and silence, her story survives. Every retelling, every chilling knock on the parlor wall, every whispered warning to children proves that she has not been forgotten. In this way, the bride becomes not only a victim but a victor. Her family may have sealed her away, but they could not silence her. The community may have tried to bury her memory, but her ghost endures. She is a reminder that the truth has a way of clawing its way out of the walls, that no voice can be silenced forever. The cultural symbolism of the Appalachian bride then is vast and layered. She is silence and shame, confinement and endurance, oppression and survival. She is both a warning and a mirror, reflecting the fears of her community and the struggles of countless women whose stories went untold. To reduce her to a simple ghost story is to miss her deeper meaning. She is not only a legend to be feared in the night, but a cultural testament to the costs of silence, the weight of family secrets, and the eternal struggle of the voiceless to be heard. And perhaps this is why her story still resonates. Because beneath the veil, beneath the white gown, beneath the walls that held her, we recognize something universal, the human need to speak, to be seen, to matter. The Appalachian bride scratches not only at her prison, but at our conscience, reminding us that silence is its own kind of burial, and that some voices will never stop trying to break free. The story of the Appalachian bride buried alive in her own home is not one that fades when the fire burns low or when the night gives way to morning light. It clings. It lingers. It scratches at the mind the way she was said to scratch at her wooden tomb. Long after the parlor collapsed, long after the house rotted away and its timber was reclaimed by the forest, her legend still walks the ridges and hollers. She is more than a ghost, more than a piece of folklore. She is a question with no answer, an echo with no source, a haunting that will not release its grip on those who hear it. And that is precisely why her story endures. In the end, what chills us is not only the thought of a woman sealed alive within walls. It is what she represents, the unacknowledged traumas that families and communities bury, the silences that suffocate louder than screams, the way injustice echoes across generations. Her story survives not because we want to believe in ghosts, but because we cannot help but recognize truth within her cries. We know, whether consciously or not, that there are countless others like her, voices silenced, lives unfinished, stories never told. The bride's haunting is both literal and metaphorical, both a tragedy of the past and a mirror held up to the present. What is striking is how her legend refuses to die. Skeptics may scoff, believers may shudder, yet both keep the story alive. Every debate about whether she was real or imagined, every whispered retelling around a campfire, every dare to walk past the ruins at night, ensures her presence lingers. In this sense, the bride has achieved what many living cannot. She has transcended time. The family that betrayed her is gone. The house that imprisoned her has crumbled, but she remains bound to the land and to the imagination of everyone who hears her tale. The haunting has become eternal, not because her ghost is proven, but because her memory is unavoidable. And what of those who claim to see her still? The flicker of white among the trees, the soft knock on old timber, the sudden chill that cuts through a summer night. These encounters may never convince a skeptic, but to the witness they are undeniable. Paranormal investigators bring cameras and recorders, eager to capture proof, but whether they return with evidence or only eerie feelings, the effect is the same. The bride remains in the conversation, impossible to dismiss. The haunting is not simply her presence, it is the persistence of her story in the face of every attempt to bury it. Folklore scholars remind us that ghosts serve a purpose. They do not endure because they entertain, they endure because they speak truths the living dare not say. The Appalachian bride is a truth teller, though her words are muffled by wood and stone. She speaks of the dangers of silence, of the cruelty hidden in ordinary homes, of the thin line between love and control. She reminds us that even the safest places, the parlor where families gather, the home meant to shelter, can become prisons. That reminder unsettles us because it is too close to reality. We know that walls hold secrets. We know that cries go unheard. And so we cannot release her, because she will not release us. Her symbolism reaches far beyond the mountains. She joins a lineage of restless brides, of weeping women, of white ladies who haunt cultures across the world. Each is a variation on the same theme: women silenced, lives cut short, grief turned into ghostliness. Yet the Appalachian bride is distinct in her setting, her intimacy, her claustrophobic confinement. Unlike specters who wander moors or riverbanks, she is trapped within her own home, scratching at the very heart of domesticity. That detail makes her one of the most terrifying archetypes of all, not a ghost that lurks out there in the dark, but a ghost born inside the home itself. For Appalachia, her legend has become part of cultural identity. The mountains have always been a place where history and myth blur, where memory is preserved through story, rather than paper. In this landscape, the buried bride is more than entertainment. She is heritage, a reminder of the region's deep currents of secrecy, trauma, and resilience. To know her story is to understand something essential about the mountains, that beauty and horror walk hand in hand, that silence carries weight, that ghosts are as real as the people who believe in them. And what does she mean for us today? In a time when voices once silenced are beginning to rise, her story resonates anew. She is not just an Appalachian ghost. She is a universal reminder of what happens when cries for help go unanswered. She is the woman whose suffering was hidden to preserve appearances, the daughter sacrificed to family honor, the human being reduced to a secret. Her legend warns us that silence is deadly, that ignoring injustice allows it to fester, that the walls we build to contain our secrets eventually become haunted by them. As this story closes, we return to the image that has carried us through: a young bride, dressed in white, standing at the threshold of life, only to be sealed inside her home. The scratching grows faint, the cries weaken, and eventually silence falls. But silence is deceptive, for though her voice was muffled in life, it grew louder in death. Each retelling is another scratch, another cry, another demand to be heard. She did not die forgotten. She did not remain buried. She has clawed her way into legend, into culture, into us. Perhaps that is the true haunting. Not the ghostly veil glimpsed at midnight, not the knocks that echo in an empty room, but the way her story burrows into the listener's mind. We imagine her there in the darkness, nails tearing at the wood, breath growing shallow, hope extinguishing one gasp at a time. And once imagined, she cannot be erased. The walls may have fallen, the house may have rotted, but we carry her prison within us. She scratches still, not at the boards of her parlor, but at the walls of our conscience. The Appalachian bride remains. She remains in the whispers of families who will not name her. She remains in the shiver of children passing the ruins. She remains in the folklore that binds Appalachia together, in the debates of skeptics and believers, in the hearts of all who hear her tale. She is a ghost, not because she lingers in one house, but because she lingers in every retelling. And so, as the last words of her story fade into silence, we are left with a choice. Do we treat her as mere legend, dismiss her as a phantom of imagination, or do we listen to the scratching, to the cries, to the truths buried within the walls of her tale? For if we listen closely, we may find she is not only haunting a parlor in the mountains, she is haunting us. The bride who was buried alive, never left her home, and perhaps in some way she never will. Not every story of dark history and folklore needs a final chapter, but the Appalachian bride demands one. Her legend refuses to sit quietly within the walls of her house. It bleeds outward, finding its way into novels, local ghost tours, whispered stories at campfires, even into the broader cultural imagination. In this final section, we step back from the parlor and the scratching to look at the afterlife of her story, the ways it has been retold, reimagined, and repurposed in the modern age, and what this endurance tells us about the human need for ghosts. The Appalachian region has always thrived on storytelling, but in the last century, the bride's tale has crossed from oral tradition into modern media. Local newspapers occasionally mention her as part of haunted Appalachia roundups, usually nestled beside tales of phantom coal miners and Civil War specters. Paranormal investigation shows have woven her into their narratives, sometimes embellishing her cries with ominous recordings and night vision footage. Writers of Appalachian Gothic fiction have adapted her story, casting her as a restless archetype of women silenced by family duty. Even social media has picked her up. Urban exploration channels film the ruins of old homes, claiming to feel her presence, while TikTok storytellers retell her legend in bite-sized horror clips. Each version may alter the details, but all of them keep her alive. This migration of folklore into popular culture carries symbolic weight. For centuries, her story lived in shadows, shared in kitchens, on porches, and in firelight gatherings. Today, it flickers across screens worldwide, reaching audiences far beyond the mountains. In this transformation, she has become more than a local ghost. She is now part of global folklore, standing beside La Llorona, Bloody Mary, and the countless white ladies who haunt roads and ruins across cultures. But unlike many of these figures, the Appalachian bride carries a deeply domestic weight. Her haunting is not tied to a battlefield, a riverbank, or a desolate highway. It is tied to a home. And in a world where the home is often seen as sanctuary, this makes her story uniquely unsettling. Her persistence in popular imagination reveals something essential about why we cling to ghost stories. Ghosts remind us of unfinished business, of justice denied, of truths buried. They allow us to confront fears we cannot name directly, fears of family betrayal, of silence, of being forgotten. The Appalachian bride embodies all of these at once. She gives shape to anxieties that remain painfully relevant, women silenced in households, communities hiding their darkest secrets, voices lost beneath the weight of tradition. In her we find both terror and recognition. She is frightening precisely because she feels so familiar. Skeptics argue that her modern popularity strips away her cultural context, reducing her to a spooky anecdote for tourist dollars and viral clicks. There is truth to this. Many ghost tours that include her speak only of scratching and crying, omitting the deeper symbolism of silence and confinement. Horror fiction often uses her as a trope without honoring the cultural roots of her legend, yet even when diluted, her story still carries a spark of its original power. A TikTok viewer in California may not know Appalachian history, but they will still feel the dread of imagining a woman walled away in her own home, and in that dread, they become part of the chain of transmission, keeping her alive even if they do not fully understand her. For Appalachian communities, the bride's story is both burden and heritage. Some families deny it, distancing themselves from the stain of ancestral guilt. Others embrace it, turning the legend into a symbol of resilience and warning. Folklorists and paranormal researchers alike continue to seek the real house, though its location remains contested. Each attempt to locate or debunk her adds another layer to her mythology, and this is the paradox of folklore. Every effort to pin it down only ensures its survival. The bride resists finality. She is not meant to be solved. She is meant to be retold. Modern interpreters also see her as a feminist icon. Within academic circles, she is studied not simply as a ghost story, but as a narrative of patriarchal violence, a metaphor for women erased by their families and communities. In artistic retellings, she is sometimes reimagined as triumphant, her cries not of despair but of defiance, her haunting not a curse but a refusal to be forgotten. This reframing does not erase the horror of her fate, but acknowledges the endurance of her voice. The Appalachian bride, in this reading, becomes a symbol of survival beyond death, a reminder that even the most silenced voices can echo forever. Her afterlife also underscores the universality of her themes. Though rooted in Appalachian soil, her legend resonates far beyond. The fear of being buried alive, the dread of family betrayal, the tension between silence and speech. These are not uniquely Appalachian anxieties, they are human anxieties. The bride's story taps into something primal, which is why it resonates with people who have never set foot in the Blue Ridge or the Smokies. She speaks a language older than geography, the language of injustice, silence, and the yearning to be heard. And so the bride's story continues to spread. In each retelling, whether as a chilling ghost tale or as a cultural analysis, she is resurrected. Every time someone hears her name, imagines her scratching at the walls, or wonders if the cry they heard in the night might have been her, the haunting deepens. The house may be gone, the family may be dust, but she endures. She does not belong only to Appalachia anymore, she belongs to all who listen. In the end, the Appalachian bride achieves something rare for a ghost, immortality not just in one community but across many. Her legend has crossed the boundary from local memory into global folklore, carried by the very forces, silence, secrecy, storytelling, that first created her, and in this lies the final twist of her haunting. Her family buried her, hoping to silence her forever. Instead, they created a voice that cannot be silenced, a presence that grows stronger with each retelling. The walls that once confined her have collapsed, but her story has escaped them, spreading wider than they could have ever imagined. And so she lingers, not just in the parlor where her life was stolen, but in the minds of everyone who hears her tale. She lingers in the clash of skeptics and believers, in the tension between folklore and history, in the uneasy awareness that homes can become prisons and silence can become death. She lingers because we need her to linger, because her story tells us something about ourselves, about our fears, about the price of forgetting. The Appalachian bride's legend, then, is not finished. It cannot be finished. As long as we tell her story, as long as we wonder if her cries still echo in the night, she endures, and maybe that is the most fitting justice of all. She was buried in silence, but she has risen in endless voices. Her haunting has become her immortality.